Security to ICU, we have an unauthorized person refusing to leave the premises. Zara Williams ignored the crackling announcement overhead as she continued chest compressions on the elderly white man whose heart had stopped 3 minutes ago. Her scrubs were soaked with sweat, her natural hair pulled back in a tight bun that had come loose during the chaos. The other nurses had scattered when the alarm started blaring. But she wouldn't abandon a patient in cardiac arrest. "Ma'am, you need to step away from the patient immediately." The security guard's voice was sharp, authoritative. Behind him stood Dr. Harrison, the department head who'd been gunning for her termination since she'd started 6 months ago. Arms were crossed, his face twisted with what looked like satisfaction. "His pupils are responsive, and I'm getting a pulse back," Zara said, without looking up, continuing the compressions. "If you want him to live, you'll let me finish." "She's not supposed to be working today," Dr. Harrison announced to the security guard. "She was suspended pending investigation." "This is trespassing." The patient's eyes fluttered open, and Zara felt his pulse strengthened under her fingers. Around them, the ICU buzzed with tension. Other staff members had gathered, some recording on their phones, others whispering. The story would spread through the hospital like wildfire. The black nurse, who'd been suspended for allegedly stealing medication, caught trespassing while trying to save a patient's life. What they didn't know was that Zara had been in the hospital visiting her own investment, the silent partnership she'd maintained for 3 years, pumping money into the struggling facility. Through a shell company, she'd been reviewing quarterly reports in the administrative wing when she'd heard the code blue. Her nursing instincts had kicked in before her business sense could stop her. The patient squeezed her hand weakly. "Thank you," he whispered. "You're welcome, Mr. Morrison," she replied, recognizing the name from the chart. What she didn't expect was the way his eyes widened when she spoke. Zara Williams. His voice was barely audible, but the shock was unmistakable. Dr. Harrison stepped forward. "Sir, please don't strain yourself. This woman was just leaving." But Mr. Morrison's grip on Zara's hand tightened. She's the one, the investor, the one who's been keeping this place afloat." The room fell silent, except for the steady beep of the heart monitor. Dr. Harrison's face went pale. The security guard's hand moved away from his radio. And Zara realized that her carefully maintained anonymity was about to crumble. Along with everything she'd built to protect herself and this hospital, the investigation that had led to her suspension was about to intersect with the truth about her financial involvement in the hospital. The missing medication she'd been accused of stealing was actually part of a black market scheme. She'd been investigating on her own using her access as both nurse and investor to trace the real thieves. The evidence was hidden in her office, locked away until she could present it safely. But now, with Mr. Morrison's revelation hanging in the air and Dr. Harrison's eyes narrowing with calculation, Zara knew that the next few hours would determine not just her career, but whether the hospital would survive the corruption that had been eating it from within, the same corruption that had made her a target in the first place. 3 weeks earlier, Zara had walked into Dr. Harrison's office, expecting a routine performance review. Instead, she found herself facing accusations that would have destroyed most nurses' careers on the spot. "These medication logs show discrepancies during your shifts," Dr. Harrison had said, sliding a folder across his desk. "Morphine, fentanyl, oxycodone, Schedule II controlled substances. The pattern is clear." Zara had studied the documents, her trained eye immediately spotting the inconsistencies. The handwriting wasn't hers on half the entries. The timing of the alleged thefts coincided with shifts she'd been in surgery, assisting with emergency procedures. But pointing out these obvious flaws would have required revealing. How she knew so much about the hospital's operations beyond her nursing duties. "I've never stolen medication from this hospital," she'd said simply. "The evidence suggests otherwise." Dr. Harrison's tone was cold, professional. "We're placing you on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Security will escort you out." The walk through the hospital corridors had been humiliating. Colleagues she'd worked alongside for months stared as the security guard flanked her to the exit. Some looked sympathetic, others suspicious. The whispers started before she'd even reached the parking lot. What none of them knew was that Zara had been conducting her own investigation for weeks. As the hospital's silent investor, she'd noticed irregularities in the financial report's missing inventory, unexplained cost overruns, suspicious vendor relationships. She'd started tracking medication usage patterns, cross-referencing them with staff schedules and patient census reports. The real thieves were sophisticated. They'd created false documentation, manipulated computer records, and established a network of buyers for the stolen drugs. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed a black nurse would be the perfect scapegoat. Someone with no powerful connections, no family wealth, no ability to fight back against accusations. They'd chosen wrong. In her car outside the hospital, Zara had pulled out her phone and called her lawyer. Not the public defender most nurses in her position would have gotten, but Thomas Chen, a partner at the city's most prestigious law firm, the same firm that handled her investment portfolio and business dealings. "They're trying to frame me," she'd told him, "and I think I know who's behind it." Zara's apartment looked nothing like what people expected from a hospital nurse. The downtown loft was spacious, modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. The walls were lined with medical textbooks alongside business journals and financial reports. Her laptop was always open to 3 screens: stock portfolios, hospital financial data, and nursing research. She'd bought the place with money from her first successful investment, a small biotech startup that had developed a breakthrough pain medication. The profits had funded her nursing degree, her business education, and eventually her silent partnership in Metropolitan General Hospital. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd become an investor to have a voice in healthcare, to push for better working conditions and patient care from the inside. But she'd also become a nurse because she couldn't stand being disconnected from the actual work of healing. The combination had made her powerful and vulnerable in equal measure. Now, spread across her dining table were months of financial records, medication logs, and staff schedules. The pattern was becoming clear. The thefts weren't random, they were systematic, organized, and tied to specific shifts and departments. More troubling, they seemed to coincide with budget meetings where Dr. Harrison had pushed for cost-cutting measures that would have impacted patient care. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maya, one of the few nurses who'd believed in her innocence. From the beginning, security footage from the medication room disappeared from the server. IT says it was a technical malfunction. Zara stared at the message, her suspicions crystallizing into certainty. Someone with administrative access was covering their tracks, deleting evidence that would have proven her innocence. The same someone who'd had access to create the false documentation that implicated her. She pulled up the hospital's organizational chart on her laptop. Dr. Harrison had been pushing for her termination since she'd started, but she'd assumed it was typical workplace prejudice. Now she wondered if there was more to it. Had he recognized her somehow? Did he know about her investment in the hospital? Her investigation had revealed that Dr. Harrison had been flagged by the DIT 2 years ago for prescribing practices that raised red flags. The investigation had been dropped due to lack of evidence, but the pattern was there. A doctor with financial pressures, access to controlled substances, and a history of questionable decisions. The missing medication wasn't being stolen by a nurse desperate for drugs. It was being diverted by someone with the authority to manipulate records and the connections to move the drugs without detection. Someone who needed a scapegoat to cover their tracks when the scheme inevitably attracted attention. As she worked through the night, cross-referencing data and building her case, Zara realized that saving her career was only part of the challenge. The real question was whether she could expose the truth without revealing her identity as the hospital's investor and whether the hospital could survive the scandal that was about to break. The meeting was set for 2 a.m. in the hospital's abandoned wing, a section that had been closed for renovations that never materialized. Zara knew she was taking a massive risk, but the evidence she'd gathered pointed to a conspiracy that went beyond Dr. Harrison. She needed to see the operation firsthand. She'd spent weeks cultivating her source, James, a night shift orderly, who'd been recruited into the drug diversion scheme, but was having second thoughts. The guilt was eating him alive, especially after he'd learned that Zara was being blamed for thefts he'd participated in. "They told me she was already stealing," James had whispered during their clandestine phone call. "Said they were just making sure she got caught for something she was already doing. I believed them because ... Because I'm black," Zara had finished for him. "And it was easier to believe I was a criminal than to question what you were being asked to do." The silence on the other end had been answer enough now, hidden. In the shadows of the construction zone, Zara watched as the network operated. Dr. Harrison wasn't just a participant, he was the organizer. He had keys to every medication room, access to all the computer systems, and the authority to override security protocols. But he wasn't working alone. Patricia Woods, the head of pharmacy, was there. Along with 2 other doctors, Zara didn't. Recognized they moved with the efficiency of long practice, filling unmarked bottles with controlled substances, while Patricia manipulated the computer records to show normal usage. Patterns? "The Morrison account is getting suspicious," one of the doctors said. "He's been asking questions about medication costs versus patient census." Zara's blood ran cold. Morrison, the patient she'd just saved, the one who'd recognized her as the investor. He wasn't just a random cardiac patient. He was connected to the hospital's board, someone with access to financial information that could expose the scheme. "We need to accelerate the timeline," Dr. Harrison replied. "The Williams situation has bought us some cover, but not for long." "If Morrison starts digging, ... what about the investor?" Patricia asked, "the silent partner who's been pumping money into this place, if they decide to do an audit." "They won't," Dr. Harrison said with confidence. "Silent partners stay silent for a reason. They don't want scrutiny any more than we do." Zara had heard enough. She began backing away from her hiding spot, but her foot caught on a piece of debris. The clatter echoed through the empty corridor, and suddenly flashlights were swinging in her direction. "Someone's here," Dr. Harrison hissed. Zara ran. Behind her, she could hear footsteps pounding against the concrete floor, voices shouting instructions. She knew these corridors from her nursing shifts, but in the dark, everything looked different. She took a wrong turn, then another, and suddenly found herself trapped in a dead-end storage room. The door burst open, and Dr. Harrison stood silhouetted in the doorway, his face twisted with rage and fear. "Well, well," he said, "the suspended nurse who can't stay away from the hospital. Breaking and entering now, are we?" "I know what you're doing," Zara said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "The drug diversions, the falsified records, the frame-up, all of it." Dr. Harrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. "And who's going to believe you? A suspended nurse with a grudge against the hospital. A black woman with a history of substance abuse. I don't have a history of substance abuse. You will by tomorrow morning. Amazing what medical records can show when they're properly adjusted." Zara realized with growing horror that the conspiracy was more extensive than she'd imagined. They weren't just stealing drugs, they were prepared to destroy lives, manipulate medical records, and commit fraud on a massive scale to protect their operation. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They still didn't know who she really was. The cardiac emergency had shattered more than just the conspiracy's timeline. It had forced Zara's hand in ways she'd never anticipated. As Mr. Morrison lay recovering in the ICU, the full weight of his recognition was beginning to sink in throughout the hospital. "I need to speak with the hospital administrator," Morrison said weakly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "And I need to speak with Ms. Williams, privately." Dr. Harrison hovered nearby, his face pale and sweat beading on his forehead. "Sir, I really don't think, Dr. Harrison," Morrison's voice cut through the objection. Like a blade, "I'm sure you have other patients to attend to." The dismissal was clear, but Harrison hesitated. "The woman who assisted you, ... she's not supposed to be here. She's under investigation for allegations that I'm beginning to suspect are completely fabricated," Morrison finished. "Now, unless you want to explain to the board why you're interfering with the discussion between the hospital's primary benefactor and a member of our investment team, I suggest you leave." The words hit the gathered staff like a physical blow. Investment team, primary benefactor? The whispers started immediately, and Zara could see the realization dawning on faces around the room. The suspended nurse they'd been gossiping about wasn't just fighting for her career. She was fighting for an investment worth millions. Administrator Sarah Chen arrived within minutes, her normally composed demeanor cracking as she took in the scene. She'd been the one to coordinate with the silent investors' representatives, never knowing that the mysterious Z. Williams, who'd been funneling money into the hospital, was standing in front of her in scrubs. Ms. Williams, Administrator Chen, said carefully, "I think we need to have a conversation." "In private?" "Yes," Zara replied, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling around her. "I think we do." The conference room they retreated to was the same one where Zara had been reviewing financial reports when she'd heard the code blue. The irony wasn't lost on her as she sat across from Administrator Chen, no longer hiding behind corporate lawyers and shell companies. "You're the investor," Chen said, more statement than question, "the one who's been keeping us afloat for 3 years. "I am, and you've been working here as a nurse for 6 months. I wanted to see the hospital from the inside, to understand where the money was really going, how it was being used." Zara leaned forward. "What I found was a massive drug diversion scheme orchestrated by Dr. Harrison and several other staff members." Chun's face went white. "The investigation into your alleged thefts was designed to frame me for crimes I was actually investigating. They needed a scapegoat, and they chose the black nurse with no apparent connections or resources to fight back." Zara's voice hardened. "They chose wrong. Do you have evidence?" Zara pulled out her phone, scrolling through photos and recordings. She'd gathered over weeks of investigation. Financial records showing inventory discrepancies, medication logs with forged signatures, security footage, timestamps that don't match the alleged theft times, and as of 2 hours ago, video evidence of Dr. Harrison and his team in the act of diverting drugs. The recording from the abandoned wing played on her phone screen, showing Dr. Harrison clearly coordinating the illegal operation. Chen watched in horrified silence as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. This is massive," Chen whispered. "The liability alone could destroy the hospital." "Which is why we need to handle this carefully," Zara said. "The drugs can be recovered, the financial losses can be recouped, and the hospital can survive this. But only if we act quickly and decisively. What do you propose?" "Full cooperation with law enforcement, immediate suspension of all involved parties, and a complete audit of medication management systems." Zara paused. "And my reinstatement as a nurse with a public apology for the false accusations." Chen nodded slowly. "And your investment in the hospital? That depends on whether you can prove to me that this institution is worth saving." The emergency board meeting was called for 6 a.m., just as the morning shift was arriving. Word had spread through the hospital like wildfire. The suspended nurse was actually the mysterious investor. Dr. Harrison was being investigated for drug theft, and everything staff thought they knew about the situation was wrong. Zara arrived in a business suit instead of scrubs, her appearance commanding attention as she walked through corridors where she'd once been escorted out by security. The same security guards who'd been prepared to arrest her 12 hours ago now nodded respectfully as she passed. The boardroom was packed with hospital administrators, department heads, and legal counsel. Dr. Harrison sat at the far end of the table, his lawyer beside him, his face a mask of defiance and barely controlled panic. "Let me be clear about what we're dealing with," Zara began, standing at the head of the table where PowerPoint slides displayed the evidence she'd gathered. "This isn't just about stolen medication. This is about a systematic conspiracy to defraud the hospital, manipulate medical records, and destroy the career of anyone who got too close to the truth." The slides showed financial data, medication logs, and security footage that painted a picture of corruption that went far beyond simple theft. The room was silent, except for the click of keyboards as lawyers took notes and administrators calculated the potential liability. Dr. Harrison, Board Chairman Roberts, said, his voice heavy with disappointment, "What is your response to these allegations?" Harrison's lawyer started to speak, but Harrison cut him off. This is a witch hunt orchestrated by a nurse with a grudge. She's been caught stealing medications, and now she's fabricating evidence too. To what? Zara interrupted. To destroy my own investment. To damage the hospital I've been financially supporting for 3 years. She turned to face him directly. You made a fundamental error, Dr. Harrison. You assumed I was powerless because I'm black, because I'm a nurse, because I didn't fit your image of who could be a threat to your operation. You have no proof that I have video of you coordinating drug diversions. I have financial records showing medication discrepancies that coincide with your shifts. I have testimony from staff members you recruited into your scheme. Zara's voice was cold, professional. And I have the real medication logs that show my handwriting was forged on the documents used to frame me. The room erupted in whispers. As the implications sank in, Dr. Harrison's face went from defiant to desperate as his lawyer whispered urgently in his ear. Furthermore, Zara continued, I have evidence that patient care was compromised by this scheme. Patients didn't receive prescribed pain medication because it was being diverted. Medical records were falsified to cover up the thefts. And at least one patient, Mr. Morrison, was targeted for elimination because he was getting too close to the truth. That's preposterous, Harrison snapped. Morrison had a heart attack. That's not Morrison had a heart attack after receiving a medication that wasn't prescribed to him, Zara said quietly. A medication that would have been fatal if I hadn't been there to provide immediate care. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Harrison's lawyer looked stunned by the implication. You're suggesting attempted murder, Chairman Roberts said slowly. I'm suggesting that when people are desperate to protect $1 million criminal enterprise, they make desperate choices. Zara looked around the room. The question now is whether this hospital is going to take responsibility for what happened and work to rebuild trust, or whether it's going to continue covering up the truth. 6 months later, Zara stood in the same ICU where the crisis had begun, but everything had changed. The medication room had new security protocols, the staff had undergone extensive retraining, and the hospital's financial oversight had been completely restructured. Dr. Harrison was in federal prison, along with 2 other doctors and the head of pharmacy. The drug diversion scheme had been worth over $2 million in stolen medications, money that was being recovered through asset forfeiture and insurance claims. More importantly, the hospital had survived. Patient confidence was returning, staff morale was improving, and the financial reforms Zara had implemented as both investor and newly appointed chief nursing officer were beginning to show results. Ms. Williams, a young nurse, approached her, clipboard in hand. Mr. Morrison is asking for you. He says it's about the new cardiac wing. Zara smiled. Morrison had recovered fully from his heart attack and had become one of her strongest allies. On the hospital board, the new cardiac wing was going to be funded through a combination of her investment funds and a federal grant they'd secured by demonstrating the hospital's commitment to reform. As she walked through the corridors, Zara reflected on how the crisis had forced her to confront the complexity of her dual identity. She'd tried to keep her roles as nurse and investor separate, but the experience had taught her that true change required her to embrace both aspects of her power. The whispers followed her now, but they were different. Instead of suspicion and gossip, there was respect and curiosity. The staff knew her story, the nurse who'd been falsely accused, who'd fought back with resources no one knew she had, who'd saved not just a patient's life, but the hospital itself. The cardiac wing is going to be beautiful, Morrison said as she entered his room. He was sitting up in bed, reviewing architectural plans on his tablet. But I have to ask why. Didn't you tell anyone who you were from the beginning? You could have avoided all of this. Zara considered the question. Because I needed to understand what it was like to be powerless in this system. To experience what happens when people make assumptions based on race and class and professional status. She paused. And because the power I had as an investor was only meaningful if I combined it with the knowledge I gained as a nurse. The best of both worlds. The responsibility of both worlds, Zara corrected. Money gives you influence, but it doesn't give you wisdom. Working on the front lines, being dismissed and underestimated, That taught me things no boardroom ever could." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "And now I know that real change requires both perspectives, the financial resources to make things happen, and the ground-level experience to know what needs to happen." She looked out the window at the city skyline, where construction cranes were already beginning work on the new cardiac wing. "The people who tried to frame me made one crucial mistake. They assumed that power only looks one way, that it's only held by people who look like them, who came from their background, who fit their expectations. They underestimated you. They underestimated what justice looks like when it has resources behind it." Zara turned back to Morrison. "But more than that, they underestimated what happens when someone who's been marginalized refuses to accept that marginalization as permanent." The story had spread beyond the hospital, becoming a case study in healthcare fraud and a symbol of resilience against systematic injustice. But for Zara, the real victory wasn't in the headlines or the legal settlements. It was in the knowledge that she'd used her privilege and resources to protect not just herself, but the institution she'd invested in literally and figuratively as she left Morrison's room and returned to her rounds. Zara carried with her the lessons of the crisis. Power wasn't just about having money or influence, it was about using those resources to create systems that protected everyone, especially those who couldn't protect themselves. The hospital thrived. The patients received better care. The staff worked in an environment of trust and accountability. And Zara Williams, the nurse who'd been dismissed as a thief, had become the leader who'd save them all. The transformation was complete, but the work was never finished. Justice, she'd learned, wasn't a destination, it was a commitment to doing better every day. For everyone who walked through those doors seeking healing,